So one of the things I like to remind all my aviation brethren around here, and there are only a couple thousand of them, is that I happen to represent the original pilots. Uh, Back in the day of sail, the pilots were the navigators that would make sure ships knew how to get through these passages and get to their destinations. And they often had codes, and they had, because it was a great secret how to make the trips, these voyages, and it was very lucrative if you could do it. So if you're out there and you hear aviators tell you they're pilots, just remember the original pilots were on the water. That's for you too.
I'm not sure anybody's going to buy that.
I would have to, I'd always go back. There was individual ones that were just crazy, but probably the one, because I did 2 trips in, 2 trips out, and it was a dead ship tow, it was the Oriskany, and that was a test. It was real, your dad was asking about, do you ever have a feeling about, of a little bit of concern when you're doing a job? Well, I was very concerned about bringing in an aircraft carrier, and it was dead ship tow, and so I was trying to prepare for it, and the Coast Guard had said that it had to come in daylight only, and they were very strict about that. And so I go out there at 11 in the morning and get on board, and they had broke the cable, and the cable was dragging behind the Oriskany. And so they had an emergency cable out, which they were towing on, but they were trying to get the tow cable that broke, and it was out for quite a distance, like, maybe 3/4 of a mile. And they were bringing that on board. And it was a huge cable. I forget what size it was, but they were using they had a tractor on board, and they were just pulling that line up. Needless, we lost daylight, and we're getting up around 9 o'clock. And I'm saying, looks like we're going to go in tomorrow morning because Coast Guard restricted daylight, to daylight. So we were with Resolve Marine, who was doing the work on that, and they called the Coast Guard, and they got the Coast Guard to agree to let us in on the dark, at nighttime. And they handed the phone to me, and they said, the Coast Guard wants to talk to you. And they said, yeah, well, you can go ahead and do it. He said, but I tell you what, you won't have a license if this goes wrong. And I said, and the only thing why I just decided to go ahead with it was we had lost the daytime tide, but the tide that we were going to come in we were going into berth 1 and 2 in the slip. I knew it was going to be slack water if we started in right about that time, even though it was dark. And that's what we did. We went in, and everything went fairly well. And got in, but yeah, definitely the Oriskany. And then, 2 of those things I did by myself. I was trying to get a pilot to help, just kind of watch the stern ranges and stuff, and because that was like 900 feet behind me. But and I only was able to come up with a second pilot twice. So 2 times I was up there by myself doing it. So it was really trying.
I am Matt Meilstrup. I'm relatively new to Pensacola, but spent 29 years in the active duty Coast Guard. I grew up in Indiana, and went to the Coast Guard Academy in 1988 and graduated in 1992. Upon graduation, I was assigned to a buoy tender, similar to the ships here in Pensacola, an older class though. And then over the next 29 years of my Coast Guard career, 18 of which I spent at sea on Coast Guard ships. 9 different ones to be exact. The course of my career carried me through all the different Coast Guard's operational missions. I started off buoy tending, which is repairing the aids to navigation that all the mariners use in the waterways. I actually did a Navy exchange tour where I was a Coast Guard officer assigned to a Navy patrol boat for 2 years, and that was out of Virginia. After that, I received my first command, which was a 10-person patrol boat right across the pier from the Navy ship. So I spent 4 years in that Norfolk area of Virginia. And then I ended up back at the Coast Guard Academy as an instructor on staff. I sailed the tall ship Eagle during the summers, which is a ship familiar to many people here in Pensacola. After my tour there at the Academy concluded, I spent a year as a navigator aboard that America's tall ship Eagle, followed by a tour in the remote reaches of the Pacific, Guam, which is quite a ways out, pretty close to the Philippines actually. I spent 3 years there where we sailed an old buoy tender, and then I helped with the crew. We commissioned the brand new buoy tender of the same class that Walnut is that's currently in the Port of Pensacola. That ship was named Sequoia. I've done some international affairs work. I went to graduate school for that. Then I went to my 2 big law enforcement ships for the Coast Guard. The first one was based out of Hawaii in Honolulu, a 378-foot ship Jarvis, followed by the 210-foot Confidence, which is of the similar class as the 4 ships here in Pensacola. I spent a great amount of time patrolling off of the coast of Cuba, off of Haiti, and actually doing some counter drug work down a little bit deeper into the Caribbean with that ship. I spent a year at the Marine Corps War College, followed by 2 years on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a separate tour, a second of my tours that were in the Department of Defense actually. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff does the military advising to the Secretary of Defense and the President, and that was a very neat tour. I was in 06 at that point. And that led to my culminating ship tour as the captain of the Eagle. I spent 4 years aboard her, and that wrapped up in 2019. Followed that with 2 years in Coast Guard headquarters, and I retired at 29 years as a 06 captain. So I became very interested in becoming a pilot in my Coast Guard career early on. I was working with pilots and professional mariners as I was part of the buoy tenders, working the aids navigation in the rivers and the ports around the country. These aids are vitally important to ensure the safe navigation of vessels through our port or others. Commerce is the lifeblood of the country. As I went through my Coast Guard career, I didn't necessarily believe I could become a pilot. It's only until later on, as I was very senior, that one of my friends became one out at Puget Sound, and in the conversations I had, he kind of encouraged me to try it out. Why don't you try to become one too? So I embarked on my long quest to attain my merchant mariner's licenses. I ended up getting a Master's Unlimited license based on my 29 years of service and the jobs that I held through my career, and then passing the various tests that the Coast Guard requires for professional mariners to pass before they advance those levels. My professional colleagues on the merchant mariner side, they work very diligently over the course of their career to attain each level, and it's a very methodical progression. Mine was all more in one lump sum, and that is the prerequisite to become a pilot. The state of Florida requires a day-long test. It's very long, very arduous. demonstrating knowledge across multiple specialties, including drawing the chart of the harbor from memory. And at the end of that day-long endeavor, you get a grade. And if the grade's sufficiently high, then you are asked if you'd like the position. I was fortunate. I scored pretty well, and I was offered the position here in Pensacola as the harbor pilot, and eagerly took that. So I'm excited to be here, and that's what I'm doing. In fact, I just came from bringing a ship in today. One of the great organizations here in Pensacola that I work with is the Navy League. It's a group of fine men and women that advocate and support and educate people around the country on the various sea services that the country has, namely the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, and the Merchant Marine. There are some NOAA also, professional mariners out there that are uniform service. And this group of folks puts together all sorts of events to help our professional colleagues that are still at sea, plying the trade, and it's a great group to be with. Growing up as a kid in Indiana, I really had no exposure to the ocean. I grew up on a river, so I grew a love for the water early on. And boating and fishing and swimming and just ice skating, all those things that you do. Maybe not the ice skating part in Pensacola, but once I became in the Coast Guard, I became captain of a patrol boat. One of the Navy League chapters actually sponsored us. They provided support to the crew, things that we couldn't necessarily do on our own, and that was very beneficial. So as I continued through my Coast Guard career, I tried to maintain those links with the Navy League, and that culminated here in Pensacola after I retired in being able to be the Coast Guard liaison to the board of directors here in this Pensacola chapter of the Navy League. So I serve as the intermediary between the board of directors and the various Coast Guard units here, kind of keeping both informed of what's going on, so allowing free flow of communication and seeking opportunities to help the sailors out there as they progress through their careers, and hopefully that has the same benefit that it had with me. And we come to appreciate all the people that actually do those little things that makes your service career that much more rewarding and enriching. One of the great benefits of the Navy League is it supports all the sea services, not just the Coast Guard. As the liaison to the board of directors for the Coast Guard, I certainly have a direction and a charge to kind of keep tabs on what the Coast Guard's doing and seek opportunities to help those ships. That said, we can branch out and help Navy, Marine Corps, Merchant Marine in ways that they may not be able to do themselves. One of the highlights so far in my year of service with the Navy League is the adoption of the Port of Pensacola, which allowed us to recognize the merchant mariners, a very unsung group of people that have served this country for centuries, moving cargo and supporting the trade that this country relies on. So our link here, of course, is the Port of Pensacola, and there are a number of merchant mariners, whether there be tug crews or individuals that are sailing on merchant ships across the globe. So we've adopted the port, and we try to support them just as a Navy League supports the military uniform services. So talking about animals, most people love to talk about animals. One of my most vivid memories of a engagement with an animal occurred in the Sea of Labrador. So I was the captain of Eagle, and as a short digression from the story, we were training the Coast Guard Academy cadets on how to reduce their sun lines, use a sextant to navigate by the celestial bodies, in this case the sun. And you get a line of position and you can mark your where you're at on a chart. And it's not quite as precise as the modern day electronics, but if you practice, you can be pretty close. So as we're sitting on the fantail of the Eagle, we're cruising along with light wind, so we're not moving very quickly in the Sea of Labrador. And this is June, so it's still cool, but as we were sitting there, a minke whale surfaced on the port side of the ship, just off the stern, and it kind of came up, 20 feet off the ship, and it kind of looked at us, and then it dived down around underneath the ship, and it came up on the starboard side, and it kind of looked up at us, and it did the same thing back and forth, just lazily tracing a kind of a U right underneath the ship's hull. And of course, while this is going on, all the cadets lose interest in the message or the topic at hand. Celestial navigation goes out the window, and everybody's moving on the ship from port side to starboard side, taking a look at the whale. And at one point, the whale even rolled up on its side and looked right up at us with his eyeball. We looked down at it. It kind of just fell off into the depths and came back up again. So great story of engagement with our marine life that so many of you see around Pensacola also. Whales. Whales are awesome. My favorite personally are the orcas. So when they're in a pod and they're traveling along, adults, juveniles, maybe even infants, moving as one, those black and white shapes and the fins, it's a dramatic scene. You get to see that quite a bit up in Alaska, and one of my ships I deployed up to Alaska. We would be up there for 3-month stints, acting as the search and rescue vessel in the Bering Sea for all the U.S. fishing fleet that was up there, but also enforcing our maritime boundary line between Russia and the United States. There are many foreign vessels that would love to fish our waters. We try very hard to make sure they don't fish in our waters. And so multi-purpose up there. But as you see these killer whale pods, that's just a sight to behold. One of my best stories, though, isn't actually at sea on that one. One of my crew members, when out from the ship, was ashore. We had moored the ship, and they were on liberty. And of course, we were based out of Hawaii, and a number of people in Hawaii are very avid surfers and bodyboarders. And this young man happened to bring his bodyboard along, and he wanted to go out and catch some waves off Kodiak. So he and a couple crew members went out to the beach, and he proceeded to paddle on out. In his wetsuit, of course, and he caught a wave, riding it in, beautiful. And his crew members, his buddies, are all watching him from shore, and they're becoming animated, but he doesn't understand why. What he cannot see behind him is about the 6-foot fin of the orca following him into the beach as he's body surfing in. So he banks left, so does the fin. Banks right, so does the fin, all the way in until he got to the shoreline. And the whale broke off before, ran up on the beach. And needless to say, our crew member never decided to go back out that day. It was quite the experience that he never actually saw. During the course of my time with Eagle, we would sail occasionally with Tall Ship America volunteers. It's a great relationship. These are professional mariners that sail on civilian tall ships in the United States and around the globe. And we would bring some out every summer with us to sail, and they get to sail a much larger sailing ship than they're used to, and we get the benefit of their experience, which is vast in sailing vessels. One of the neat trips we made was actually one without cadets. We were going to Europe in 2019, and the cadets were not going to embark until we reached Germany. So we had to get across the Atlantic in April. And who better to take as a force multiplier, a crew plus up, than about 15 or 20 Tall Ship America volunteers. So we sailed across with these folks, and their services were indispensable. They know how to do the rigging, they know how to repair sails, they know how to maneuver the various halyards and downhauls and sheets as we set our sails and went across the Atlantic. So one night with the Tall Ship America folks on board, we were challenged with a couple of sail casualties. We were halfway across the North Atlantic, and we were just getting ready to make our turn up towards Portsmouth, England, which was going to be our first stop, when about 11 o'clock at night, one of the sheet chains parted on one of the upper sails that we had set. So when that goes, that holds the sails down. One of them goes, the sail starts flapping uncontrollably. It's an issue. So we had to sound sail stations and get everyone up on deck, and a bunch of people had to go up into the rigging and get that sail doused and secured so it didn't damage it or the rest of the rig. So having a group of 20 seasoned Tall Ship America volunteers on board helped as a force multiplier, and we were able to sail the ship with a much smaller complement and respond to casualties just like that. So as the deputy harbor pilot, I started my training program in 2021, summer. And the first couple of trips you make in, of course, you're with the fully qualified state pilot as you learn the waterway and the best way to make approaches to piers and everything else. But eventually you have to fly birdie fly. So my very first ship that I took in alone was actually a Coast Guard ship. It seemed to be a little bit of an ironic event. So the state pilot said, you go ahead and take that one in, and we actually brought in one of the Coast Guard's law enforcement ships into the piers down at Naval Air Station Pensacola. Pretty cool. Fast forward a year, the next Coast Guard ship that I brought in actually happened to be the Coast Guard Bark Eagle, which is the ship that I commanded while still on active duty in the Coast Guard. Very ironic also. And that ship came in last summer, spent about 3 or 4 days at Palafox Pier, and gave tours to the public and had several events in town, participated in the Fiesta events. It was a great experience for all involved there, and I had the great fortune to pilot the ship into the pier. For those that aren't aware of that, the pilot actually guides the vessels from sea to the port through the narrow channels to make sure that they safely move through the waterway and prevent any chance of environmental damage or injury with any people that are plying the water, whether it's on jet skis or boats or kayaks. We see it all. all mariners at sea are faced with weather, and I've got a number of weather tales, but one of the most memorable occurred in my first summer as the commanding officer at Eagle. We were sailing from New York to Newport, which is a very short distance, and we had a week to get there. So we were just out there training and sailing and back and forth. And one night we knew there was some weather coming in. There was a frontal passage going to occur in the middle of the night, but it was supposed to be relatively light. So we doused some sail and then but kept on sailing. And I went to bed, hit the rack, as they say, somewhere around 11 o'clock. And then somewhere around 2 in the morning, the loudspeaker above my bed, my rack, came alive. Captain, lay to the bridge. Which instantly you know something's not right, because that's a little bit informal way to address the captain. Usually it's your presence is requested and something a little bit nicer. So there was obviously something going on. So I grabbed my shoes and I ran for the bridge. And so I was in shorts and shoes. And I came up the after deck house and I threw open that door, and you could tell it was sort of raining. And it was dark, of course, and I came around the starboard side of the deck house. And as I moved forward and got to where the wheels of the ship are, where the actual watch is being stood out in the open, in the air, out in the elements, I was buffeted by this driving rainstorm and this howling wind. And I'd never felt that until I came out from the lee of the deck shack. And what had happened is we had a microburst, which is a very intense thunderstorm, spin out of that weaker cold front that we thought was going to pass. Well, it passed all right, and it passed right in the dark of night, and the ship was heeling, and it was over 20 degrees, and the deck watch officers, what do I do, Captain? And he had a plan, so we just kind of reassured him, just keep following the wind around. We'll just go with the wind and keep the sails filled. One of the big dangers is you get the sails coming back at you when the wind comes around in front of the sail. That's not good. You want to keep the wind behind the sail. So we just followed the wind, and it was intense. It was blowing almost 50 knots. But we couldn't really get anybody up in the rig. So we piped the deck force, the professional crew in Eagle, to the deck. And all that we can see, it's dark until it flashes with lightning, driving rainstorm, howling wind, and up in the distance we see this glow, and it's the Queen Mary 2, the giant ocean liner. We radio them, let them know we were out there, so they wouldn't hit us. And as we followed around this storm, and after about 25 minutes of very intense blowing, things started to calm down. And that's when the deck force on the deck came up with a report. Yeah, we have a small problem. Well, the storm was so intense that it had actually taken part of our rail and pulled it off the steel. So that rail is teak, it's about yay thick. And it had actually separated, and there was a 9-foot section that was laying in the middle of the deck. That's what the sails were tied off to, and the wind was so powerful it just pulled the belaying pin and it ripped it right off the deck, right out of the rail. Unbelievable. One of the neat parts of that story, there was a young trainee. We had our youngest members of the Coast Guard, young cadets, only been in about 6 weeks in the service, come from all over the country. Many of them never even seen the ocean. And this gal was on the helm steering along with about 4 of her classmates. And after it's all over, she was really confident, really assured of how she would handle herself in the height of an emergency. And this was an emergency. But earlier in her training that summer, she had been challenged by the upper class cadets at the academy, and why are you here? What are you going to do? How are you going to handle yourself when the need presents itself? And she happened to be in the right place at the right time, and she did her job, and she did it well. And the confidence, you could see it visibly bubbling out of her. that's the reward for being on in a training position on Eagle or a similar vessel, when you see the growth happen as quickly as just 25 minutes of a storm. It's amazing. Good afternoon. I'm Matt Meilstrup. I'm the harbor pilot here in the Port of Pensacola. I became the full-time harbor pilot last summer in July, and I took over for Brian McGee, who had served here for 26 years in that capacity. It was my great fortune last fall to have a ride-along with Robert Bender sitting next to me here. He was acting as the county commissioner for District 4.
Yep.
And he had an opportunity to sail along with me, and we're going to tell you a little bit about that program and what that experience was. Robert?
No, thank you. It was great. I think I was the first one that you had done the ride along with.
Indeed.
And of course, learned it was a fluid operation. We were delayed, I think, a couple times that day. A little bit of stormy seas, storms came through, and I think when we met, you said we're up the upper limits that we would actually do this, which I thought was great, because I didn't want smooth and calm and like a little bit of a challenge of getting off the ship and things like that. But no, it was a great experience to see, to be a part of that and see what you do. Of course, I had seen you in action when we got to do the bringing the Eagle into port with her visit.
Yep.
And of course, your service that you did for the U.S. Coast Guard. So thank you for that. And I know you were the captain of that ship as well. So it was, didn't know a lot of what was going on. And of course, we were taking it all in as we were coming into port that day. But you were in control, and so that was when we first got to see that in action. But very different going out with a cargo ship than bringing the Eagle in. Just as important knowing the waterways and how it's coming in, but to see just the communication with the onboard staff and how you have control of the ship and instructing the captain on how to safely navigate our waterways. It was great to see, and then also just learning more about the port.
Sure.
You know, how the increase in activity, how many ships are coming in versus how many were coming in a couple years ago, and what they're bringing. Of course, as a commissioner, economic development was one thing that we focused on. So having the GE ship come in and having those jobs with GE and doing the wind turbines, looking at next generation, that was something that we were starting to work on, is what does that next step look like to where we can have a thriving factory making whatever GE is asking them to make in that arena of wind turbines, knowing that down the road they're going to get much bigger than where they are now.
That is coming.
That is coming to where they can't go on rail, they can't go on surface, and so again, that's something that we were working on with our economic development, but it's great. So we did have the GE ship that joined, I guess, the fleet that makes regular calls to the Port of Pensacola.
Sure.
And we have raw materials that come in. And so what a lot of people don't know is that keeps the cost of construction down, keeps the cost of roads down, concrete, things like that. And because they're not having to, that last mile isn't as long when the port's in your backyard versus not having that. So the important role that the Port of Pensacola plays in our economy is one aspect of it, but then also having that navigable waterway, working with the Corps of Engineers, and we have that because we have the port, which again keeps the channel open for our Navy ships that want to come in, keep that presence, and of course now we're having a bigger presence with the U.S. Coast Guard on NAS Pensacola, with some of those new ships that are destined to be here once they get built. So I think to have, the seaport and was so much of what made Pensacola what it is today. I mean, what gave it its luster back in the day. And of course, just the bay is why Don Tristan DeLuna sought Pensacola We now have American Magic on there, and again, they're using the port, and it's great for them. But again, to have these big commercial vessels coming in, it was a great experience. I was so happy to do that, and I think the one we took out did contract work for oil and drilling.
Yeah.
And so, actually, I was really surprised at. I think the ship was fairly old. I say fairly old, maybe not that old for ships, but 15 or 20 years old. But I was surprised at how sophisticated the equipment was in the pilot room, and of course I think they're probably not all that way. I'm sure you see all everything in between. But again, they had a lot of sophistication with what their mission was, and so I think it supported the mission, being able to have that and have that work area and being able to control everything. But I'd say some of the things that probably really surprised me were not even realizing we were moving. Sometimes, when we first left port and headed out just due south on the channel, you didn't even feel like you were really moving. And it was the sun had just gone down. It was getting late in the day, and so it was great to see. And then so it just gave a really neat perspective.
So one of the neat things about Hellcat Hangar, if you haven't been by, is they've got an aviator's hands amazingly painted on the front of the hangar. The artist has great talent. Well, if you can see, we mariners sometimes talk with our hands too. Not nearly as much as the pilots, but we do speak with our hands. That's for you.